cold dawn settles over the Ethiopian highlands. Mist coils between jagged ridges, drifting across silent valleys scarred by years of occupation. In the half-light, a small band of fighters moves along a narrow mountain path. Worn uniforms, mismatched weapons, faces carved with exhaustion, but fixed with unshakable resolve. They are farmers, priests, herders, former soldiers, a people bound not by rank or uniform, but by the simple refusal to surrender their land. Below them, an Italian convoy winds through the pass, engines rumbling against the cliffs. The fighters wait in absolute stillness, breaths shallow, hands steady on rifles older than many of them. No one speaks. No signal is needed. Every man here has buried someone. Every woman who fed them risked execution. Every child who carried messages did so knowing the price of being caught. In this suspended moment, just before the first shot, the world rarely remembers what happens next. Yet these mountains hold one of the least told chapters of the Second World War. The story of the Ethiopian Patriots, the Arbegnyoch, an army without recognition, but with more courage than any chronicle ever captured. And their struggle is about to ignite. By the late 1930s, Ethiopia had already endured one of the century's first brutal conflicts. The 1935 Italian invasion, spearheaded by Mussolini's ambitions to expand the empire, had crushed the Ethiopian army with mechanized weapons and chemical attacks. Addis Ababa fell in 1936, and Haile Selassie fled into exile, addressing the League of Nations with a plea that reverberated across the globe, though it drew little action. Italy declared Ethiopia part of its East African Empire, and the nation was forced under foreign rule. Yet in the highlands, resistance quietly took root. The Arbegnyoch, literally patriots, were a mosaic of survivors. Former soldiers, local militia, peasants with scythes, and civilians turned messengers. They knew the landscape intimately. Mountains, rivers, and valleys became allies. Trails invisible to occupiers became highways of defiance. Their numbers were never vast, their arms never modern, but their persistence became legendary. For years, small bands executed raids, ambushes, and sabotage missions, forcing the Italians to spread their forces thin across treacherous terrain. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, Ethiopia's struggle became entangled with larger global currents. The British, stationed in neighboring colonies like Sudan and Kenya, recognized the strategic importance of the Horn of Africa. By 1940, as Italy entered the wider war, the East African campaign began. Ethiopia's patriots were no longer isolated rebels. They were essential participants in a theater largely overlooked by the world, yet critical to the Axis Allies' balance in Africa. By early 1941, the tides of war in East Africa were shifting. British forces, reinforced by troops from Sudan, Kenya, and Indian contingents, began coordinated operations to reclaim territories lost to Italy. Their strategy relied heavily on local knowledge, and the Arbegnyoch became indispensable guides, spies, and fighters. They knew every hidden pass, every seasonal river crossing, every village that could shelter men and supplies. Their intelligence allowed the Allies to strike with precision, compensating for the logistical challenges of operating in rugged, often hostile terrain. Italian forces, meanwhile, struggled to maintain cohesion. Supply lines were long and vulnerable, morale waned, and isolated garrisons were subject to constant harassment. The Italians relied on fortified posts and superior firepower, but these advantages were neutralized by guerrilla tactics that kept them off balance. Even as British columns advanced, the Ethiopian resistance kept the Italians guessing, striking where least expected, vanishing into hills or forests, and reappearing elsewhere. This asymmetric warfare drained the occupiers' resources and morale, demonstrating that courage and knowledge of the land could rival tanks and artillery. By May 1941, Haile Selassie was ready to return. With British support, he landed at the port of Massawa, the ceremonial and strategic heart of Ethiopia's liberation. Behind him, the Arbegnyoch continued their relentless campaign, ensuring that every village, every valley, and every mountain corridor played its role in reclaiming the nation. The stage was set for decisive battles that would determine not only the fate of Ethiopia, but the broader struggle in East Africa, where global conflict met local resilience. In the villages and valleys of Ethiopia, the human dimension of this struggle was never far from view. Men and women carried the weight of survival and resistance in equal measure. Farmers left their fields half-tended to join ambushes. Mothers smuggled messages, food, and ammunition across enemy lines, hiding secrets in baskets of grain. Children guided soldiers along hidden paths, their small feet knowing shortcuts the occupiers would never find. Every action carried risk. Every choice could cost life. Yet there was no hesitation. Courage was not optional. It was survival writ large. Tactically, the Arbegnyoch excelled in asymmetric warfare. They avoided conventional confrontations, favoring ambushes on narrow mountain passes, sudden strikes on isolated outposts, and calculated harassment of supply lines. Italian forces, trained for open field engagements and mechanized dominance, found themselves trapped in a struggle dictated by terrain. The Patriots exploited every cliff, ravine, and river crossing, turning Ethiopia's harsh geography into a force multiplier. Even small bands could immobilize larger garrisons, their intimate knowledge of the land converting disadvantage into strategic advantage. Technologically, the disparity was stark. The Italians wielded tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Patriots had rifles, shotguns, and sometimes antiquated machine guns. Yet necessity bred ingenuity. Mines and improvised explosives were deployed with precision. Scouts communicated with signals, drums, or even concealed couriers. Firearms were maintained with whatever parts could be scavenged or improvised. Every encounter required not brute strength, but careful planning, timing, and coordination. In this context, Ethiopian resistance was not only a fight of bodies, but of intellect, adaptability, and relentless observation. Leadership shaped both the morale and effectiveness of the Arbegnyoch. Figures like Ras Abebe Arigai, Ras Emperor Haile Selassie, and other regional commanders embodied a blend of traditional authority and modern military acumen. They coordinated disparate bands, prioritized targets, and negotiated with British forces without undermining local autonomy. Their presence was as much symbolic as strategic. Seeing a familiar face leading a charge inspired ordinary fighters to extraordinary feats, reinforcing the sense that this was a struggle for the nation itself, not just fleeting survival. The enemy, the Italians, faced frustration beyond the battlefield. Their garrisons were isolated, morale fragile, and intelligence unreliable. Each ambush, each missing convoy, each unexpected attack created doubt. They were trained to fight in regimented formations, to rely on artillery barrages and mechanized support. Yet the guerrilla nature of the Ethiopian resistance rendered many of these strengths irrelevant. Their frustration was amplified by geography and climate. Mountains, seasonal rains, and the desert-like stretches of the lowlands challenged logistics, disease, and the very will to maintain control. Moral stakes ran as high as bullets and shells. The struggle was not merely about territory or politics. It was about identity, sovereignty, and justice. The Ethiopian people were fighting against occupation, against humiliation, and against a regime that had sought to erase them from history. Each skirmish carried ethical weight, each casualty a human cost that rippled through communities. The resistance blurred lines between soldier and civilian, as ordinary people took on extraordinary burdens, shaping a conflict where courage was measured not in medals, but in the refusal to surrender. By May 1941, the campaign reached a critical juncture at Amba Alagi, a fortress perched atop jagged cliffs and deemed nearly impregnable. Italian forces under the Duke of Aosta had consolidated their remaining strength, determined to hold the high ground. For weeks, Ethiopian patriots harried supply lines, cut communication routes, and guided British columns through hidden passes. The Italians were aware of the Arbegnioch, yet the depth of their coordination remained elusive. Every intercepted courier, every sudden flare of rifle fire, hinted at a force that could strike anywhere and vanish without warning. The assault began before dawn. British artillery thundered from positions carefully chosen with the guidance of Ethiopian scouts, their eyes tracking every ridge and plateau. Small bands of Arbegnioch crept along narrow ledges, moving silently in the shadows, ready to exploit any Italian retreat or weakness. The defenders, expecting conventional engagement, were disoriented by attacks coming from angles they could not defend. Italian fortifications were formidable, but the combination of local knowledge, patience, and relentless pressure began to tell. Minute by minute, the high ground changed hands, each advance a testament to coordination that transcended simple numbers or firepower. Amid the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles, the human drama unfolded. Fighters endured exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Some slipped over cliffs to flank positions, others carried wounded comrades across treacherous terrain. Every action carried immense risk, yet the spirit of resistance did not falter. By mid-morning, the fortress's fate was clear. The Arbegnioch and Allied forces had fractured the Italian line, forcing surrender or retreat. The victory was not only tactical, it was emblematic, proof that resilience, strategy, and intimate knowledge of the land could overcome the might of mechanized, well-supplied forces. The aftermath of Amba Alagi rippled quickly through Italian East Africa. With the fortress fallen, Italian forces were in full retreat, their positions increasingly isolated and vulnerable. British columns advanced from Sudan and Kenya, supported by Ethiopian guides who knew every hidden trail and every ambush point. Smaller garrisons, once thought secure, were now cut off. The Arbegnioch continued their relentless pressure, striking convoys, severing communications, and forcing surrenders that further weakened Italian control. The momentum had shifted decisively. The campaign that had seemed distant and peripheral was now an unstoppable wave of liberation. By November 1941, the last significant Italian stronghold at Gondar had fallen. Ethiopia was liberated, Haile Selassie restored, and the Arbegnioch had secured their place in history, though the wider world barely noticed. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the spirit of resistance endured. Italian forces had underestimated not only the terrain and the logistics, but the determination of a people unwilling to bow. The Arbegnioch, with minimal modern equipment, had contributed decisively to the Allied victory in East Africa, bridging local resistance with global strategic outcomes. Their fight had reshaped the balance in the region, cutting off Axis ambitions in the Horn of Africa. Yet beyond numbers and territory, the impact was deeply human. Villages that had sheltered fighters and families bore scars of occupation and battle, but also resilience. Communities that had endured years of terror found hope rekindled. The campaign highlighted a truth often overlooked. Wars are not only won by tanks or planes, but by the courage, knowledge, and resolve of people defending their home. Ethiopia's liberation demonstrated how local resistance could amplify global strategy, turning mountains and valleys into instruments of history, and ordinary citizens into heroes whose names would echo quietly, if incompletely, through the annals of war. In the quiet that followed, Ethiopia's highlands seemed to breathe again. Smoke from burning fortifications faded, rivers ran clear, and villages stirred with cautious life. The Arbegnok faded back into the shadows from which they had emerged, their deeds largely unrecorded in global headlines, yet indelibly etched into the memory of their people. They had faced an empire and outlasted it, proving that courage and conviction could shape history as decisively as armies and artillery. The mountains still held their secrets, and the paths once trodden by patriots carried the weight of sacrifice. In those valleys, one could trace the imprint of resilience, a reminder that wars are fought not only by generals and states, but by ordinary people bound by extraordinary resolve. And in that silence, Ethiopia's most overlooked heroes stood immortal, not in monuments, but in the living pulse of a nation restored.